Some time ago, I decided to take a road trip from Phoenix to San Francisco to visit my cousins, whom I'd grown up with and stayed close to all my life. We'd studied together in high school and stayed in touch despite the miles between us. They had both moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California, and each winter I made it a point to visit them. Setting off early in the morning, I wanted to take advantage of the time, making a few stops to see some of the scenic routes along the way. By the end of the second day, I had covered a lot of ground and planned to reach Berkeley by late evening on the third day. But as nightfall arrived, I found myself still hours away from my destination. The last gas station had been miles back, and now it was past 9 p.m., with only a few cars occasionally passing by on the darkened highway. Though the quiet road seemed peaceful at first, I could feel a familiar tinge of unease. I had always had a slight fear of deserted roads at night, and the isolation on this empty stretch made me nervous. Still, I pushed through, reminding myself that I'd be at my cousin's house soon enough. By now, fatigue had taken its toll. I felt the drowsiness setting in and knew I needed a coffee break. I finally spotted a small rest stop ahead, just off the highway. I pulled over, surprised by how deserted it looked. It was not one of those large, well-lit rest stops with multiple facilities. Instead, it was a small building with dim lighting and a handful of parking spaces. I noticed there were no other cars around, which struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the lateness of the hour. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The rest stop had a vending machine, a small restroom, and a few magazine racks by the door. I made my way inside, hoping to find a restroom and a quick caffeine fix. As I browsed the vending machine for an energy drink, I noticed a car pulling in. It came to a stop right next to mine, despite the empty spaces around us. My initial reaction was one of unease. Why would someone park so close when there were plenty of other spots? I quickly brushed it off, trying not to overthink it, and headed for the restroom, chalking it up to coincidence. I finished up in the restroom and walked out, hoping to get back on the road. But as I stepped outside, I saw the car still idling beside mine, headlights on, with a lone driver seated inside. For some reason, this made me nervous. I tried to ignore it and went back to the vending machine, deciding on a Red Bull. As I opened the can and took a sip, I couldn't help but glance back at the car parked by mine. The driver had finally shut off his engine, but he didn't step out right away. Instead, he seemed to be watching me, his figure dimly lit by the interior lights. Feeling an icy chill, I walked toward my car, intending to get back on the road as soon as possible. But just as I reached my vehicle, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening behind me. My heart raced, and I turned around, my nerves on high alert. A tall, bearded man in a brown leather jacket stepped out, his hands buried in his pockets. He looked to be in his late 40s, his piercing eyes staring right at me with an unsettling intensity. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carrying a rough edge as he walked toward me. I gave him a polite nod, trying to keep calm, even though every instinct screamed at me to get in my car and drive away. Just as we passed each other, I heard him call out again. "Hey, wait a minute," he said. I froze, and when I turned around, I found myself face to face with the barrel of a pistol aimed right at me. My pulse pounded as I struggled to steady my breath. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" he sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. I raised my hands, trying to show him I meant no harm. I felt the cold terror settle in, and I muttered, "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Just take whatever you want." He ordered me to hand over my wallet, my watch, and my phone. I did exactly as he demanded, hoping that he'd leave after taking my valuables. But instead, he jerked his head toward the dark stretch of trees lining the edge of the rest stop. "Walk," he said curtly, motioning with his gun. My heart sank. It was clear he didn't intend to just rob me. My mind raced with escape plans, but nothing seemed feasible with his gun trained on me. I pleaded with him, offering to give him my car or any money he wanted, but he only laughed in response, his eyes cold and unyielding. He led me deeper into the trees, the night cloaking us in darkness as we went farther from the road and any hope of safety. Finally, after about 20 yards, he told me to stop and turn around. The realization hit me like a punch. I wasn't going to make it out of there. This was the end. I stared into his merciless eyes, which were now filled with a sick satisfaction. My whole body trembled as he pointed the gun at my face and told me to kneel. As I dropped to my knees, I closed my eyes, silently praying, my mind racing with memories of my family and friends. I braced myself for the end, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. But then, something unexpected happened. A loud scream shattered the silence, followed by a distinct rustling from the brush. Startled, I opened my eyes to see the man convulsing, his face twisted in agony. He dropped the gun, clutching his leg where a rattlesnake had latched on, its fangs buried deep into his flesh. His expression shifted from smug confidence to sheer panic as he stumbled backward, releasing the pistol from his grip. I didn't waste a second. With adrenaline coursing through me, I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the gun, and bolted back toward the road, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the parking area and immediately dialed 911. It felt like hours before the flashing lights of police cars pierced the darkness. An officer approached me, guiding me to a safe spot while the others ventured into the woods, weapons drawn. I sat by my car, too shaken to speak, and waited as they combed through the trees. After what seemed like an eternity, the officers returned, their faces grim. The lead detective informed me that the man was dead by the time they found him. As it turned out, he was a wanted serial killer who had been terrorizing the highways across the region, targeting lone travelers. He had already claimed the lives of 3 people, leaving their bodies in isolated areas just like this one. It seemed that fate had intervened in a way no one could have anticipated. The officer's words settled heavily over me, and I couldn't help but feel a chilling gratitude for the twist of fate that saved my life. The venomous bite of the rattlesnake had been the very thing that stopped him, and in an ironic twist, his intended victim had escaped. As I drove away, still reeling from the encounter, I knew that night would stay with me forever. I'd come within inches of death, and the haunting image of that man's cold gaze would linger in my mind for years to come. Though I tried to shake the feeling of dread, every time I saw a dark stretch of highway, I was reminded of that close call, a strange mixture of horror and gratitude gnawing at me. To this day, I think about that night whenever I'm alone on a deserted road, and I can't help but glance over my shoulder, hoping I'll never encounter anything like that again. Officer Jake Thompson had been a state trooper for over 2 decades, navigating countless close calls and unimaginable encounters along the desolate highways of Pennsylvania. But no experience had ever shaken him to his core, quite like the events that unfolded one fog-drenched night along Route 30, near the outskirts of Lancaster. It was just past 2 a.m., a time when the highway was an eerie sight, with only the occasional distant headlights piercing through the thick, murky mist. Jake's beat ran along stretches of road that, in daylight, looked unremarkable, but by nightfall turned unsettling, as if hiding secrets only meant for the darkness. Unlike his usual solo patrols, Jake had a cameraman with him that night, Joe, who was shadowing him for the once popular TV show Highway Watch. The show's purpose was to capture the real-life experiences of officers on duty, giving viewers a glimpse of the danger and drama of police work. Jake was usually a private man, but Joe's presence, with the camera's reassuring red light blinking, didn't bother him. They had already developed an unspoken bond over their shared silence and the heavy, humid air of night patrols. Joe had his camera ready as they patrolled the outer edge of Lancaster, the heart of Pennsylvania's Amish country, but also a landscape marked by abandoned buildings and neglected businesses. This part of Lancaster County was a place where factories had once hummed with life, but were now replaced by crumbling structures and overgrown lots. Over the years, Jake had learned these deserted sites weren't as empty as they appeared. They had become hotspots for unsavory activities, drug deals, smuggling operations, and worse. As they approached a derelict gas station at the edge of town, something unusual caught Jake's eye, a flickering beam of light darting from inside the broken windows. His brows knitted in suspicion. "Strange," he muttered. "No cars around, but someone's inside." Joe raised the camera, already sensing the tension. "You want me to stay here?" he asked quietly. Jake nodded, more out of instinct than worry. "Yeah, wait here. Just keep an eye out." Jake's voice was low but firm. With one last look toward the dark building, Jake turned on his cruiser's loudspeaker. His voice boomed through the silent night, cutting through the dense fog like a blade. "This is Officer Thompson of the Pennsylvania State Police. Whoever's in there, come out with your hands up." As soon as his voice echoed through the cold night air, the flashlight went out, leaving nothing but silence. An unsettling stillness settled over the area, so thick that it felt as though the air itself had become heavier. Jake's instincts screamed at him to tread carefully, but duty compelled him to investigate. "Stay here, Joe," Jake said, giving the cameraman a nod. He pulled his flashlight from his belt, its harsh beam slicing through the thick night as he cautiously approached the gas station. The building loomed in front of him, a grim, decaying structure covered in graffiti and surrounded by overgrown weeds. As he neared the entrance, a rancid stench hit him. It was as if a small animal had died inside and been left to rot, a scent so sickly and thick that it settled in his throat, making him gag. "Anyone inside?" he called out, his voice echoing off the hollow walls. The only reply was silence, the kind that sinks into your skin and fills you with a sense of dread. The interior was pitch black, save for the faint beam from Jake's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by the sudden intrusion. Jake's flashlight swept across shelves covered in grime, empty cans, and wrappers strewn across the floor, remnants of a place long abandoned. He listened closely, straining to catch any sound, and that's when he heard it, a faint scraping noise coming from the back of the building, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Jake's pulse quickened. The sound was eerie, unnatural in the oppressive silence. "Police! Show yourself!" he shouted, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. At the far end of the building, his light caught a shadowy figure, hunched and motionless, watching him from the darkened corner. For a moment, their eyes met, or rather, he felt the weight of the figure's gaze, something dark and unreadable. Without warning, the figure bolted toward the rear exit, disappearing before Jake could process the movement. Swearing under his breath, he ran after the shadow, but as soon as he burst through the back door, he was greeted by an expanse of cornfields stretching into the black horizon. The stalks rustled softly in the breeze, their tops swaying, masking any sign of the man's escape. "Damn it," Jake muttered, scanning the cornfields, but he knew the chances of finding anyone in that thick maze were slim. The shadows seemed to swallow any movement, leaving him feeling isolated and vulnerable. Reluctantly, he turned back, his heart still racing. As he re-entered the gas station, an unsettling sense of dread gnawed at him, more intense than before. It was as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting. Moving cautiously, he shined his light into the back room, and what he found made his stomach lurch. A lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, its pale skin stretched taut, the vacant eyes staring up at the ceiling. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he knelt down to inspect the body, the scene too gruesome and surreal to fully process. Then, a heavy blow struck the back of his head. Pain shot through his skull, and his vision went dark as he collapsed to the cold, unforgiving floor. Jake awoke to the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. He blinked, wincing against the blinding pain radiating from his skull. His hands felt numb, and his head throbbed with every heartbeat. It took him a moment to realize he was in a hospital, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptics and gauze. "Jake, thank God you're awake," a familiar voice murmured. His colleague, Officer Mitchell, was seated beside him, relief etched across his face. What happened?" Jake rasped, his voice hoarse, struggling to piece together fragments of the night. Mitchell shifted in his chair, glancing away as if choosing his words carefully. "You were ambushed, Jake. Turns out there was a whole group of them. Joe, the cameraman, was a quick thinker. When you didn't come back, he called for backup, and we arrived just in time." Mitchell recounted how the dead body in the gas station wasn't a random victim, but a casualty of Lancaster's growing drug syndicate. The gas station had been repurposed as a dumping ground for bodies and a cover for the gang's gruesome operations. When you chased that guy outside, his accomplices must have realized you were alone inside. They seized the chance, knocked you out, and tied you up in the back room, Mitchell said, his voice thick with tension. They were planning to drag you out into the cornfields, Jake. It didn't look like they were planning to let you leave alive. Jake shuddered at the thought. The night's events played back in his mind. The flashlight, the dragging sound, the lifeless stare of the body on the floor. His heart pounded as he imagined what could have happened if backup hadn't arrived in time. "Joe, he saved my life," Jake murmured, the weight of gratitude settling heavily in his chest. Mitchell nodded solemnly. Without him, they would have gotten away with it. The backup team managed to apprehend the 2 gang members who stayed behind, and we were able to round up the rest of their operation. Lancaster PD finally shut down one of the biggest drug rings in the area. Days later, Jake returned to duty, but something in him had changed. He couldn't shake the image of the gas station at night, the twisted shadows lurking just out of sight, the faint scent of decay clinging to his memories. The events haunted him, lingering in the corners of his mind. Word soon spread among the force about Jake's encounter. The gas station became known as the Midnight Trap, and the story of Officer Thompson's near-death experience was whispered in hushed tones, a cautionary tale that echoed through the halls of the Lancaster precinct. Even now, years later, Jake avoids Route 30 on his night shifts. The memory remains a scar, a silent reminder of how close he had come to becoming another forgotten shadow in the cornfields of Lancaster. I had just joined the California Highway Patrol, stationed in the Trinity County region, patrolling the winding stretches of Route 299. Route 299 is known for its isolated stretches, cutting through endless trees that seem to close in on you, particularly at night. I'd been on the job for only 3 months, still finding my footing. Out here, it wasn't uncommon to go hours without encountering another officer, and our coverage was mostly solo. Some people think the job of a highway patrol officer is all routine traffic stops and paperwork, but in these parts, it could feel like a whole different world, especially after dark. Working the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift was tough at first. Long nights stretched endlessly, with me in the patrol car by myself, relying on my training and instincts. When I joined the force, I'd anticipated this. I knew there'd be quiet nights, long roads, and long stretches without any action. But I'd also come to understand why these shifts were so important. On quiet nights, there was no shortage of speeders and reckless drivers trying to get a thrill out on the open road. At night, I found myself issuing ticket after ticket to late-night speedsters. But that night, things felt different. It was a Thursday, around 2 a.m., and the highway was absolutely silent. Not even a single vehicle had passed by in almost 10 minutes, which was unusual for even this lonely stretch. As I drove, I slowed down to a cautious 50 miles per hour, aware that deer and other wildlife could dart out from the forest, especially on these remote roads. The only light came from my headlights illuminating the road and a faint glow from the dashboard. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared on the shoulder of the road up ahead, just barely illuminated by my headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a dark-colored sedan, parked awkwardly on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. The driver's side door was wide open, blocking most of my lane, as if the driver had left in a hurry. I slowed down and pulled up behind the vehicle, turning on my own flashing lights to alert any approaching traffic. After radioing in to inform the dispatcher of an abandoned car on the highway, I got out to investigate, my flashlight in hand. The first thing I noticed as I approached was that the car was still running. The inside lights were on, and the keys were in the ignition. The engine's low hum echoed faintly into the surrounding forest, adding to the eerie silence that had settled over everything. I scanned the area with my flashlight, sweeping it across the woods on both sides, but there was nothing, just darkness and trees that stretched on for miles. I stepped closer and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the rustle of leaves and a distant hoot of an owl. A cold chill went down my spine, an instinctive feeling that something was wrong. I reached for my radio, about to call for backup, when a flicker of movement caught my eye. Near the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood watching me. It was a man, motionless, staring directly at me. He wore a strange mask, Not like the simple cloth masks people had worn during the pandemic, nor a ski mask. This mask was more sinister, with hollow eye holes and a twisted expression that seemed designed to unnerve anyone who saw it. My heart pounded as I raised my flashlight toward him, trying to get a better look. The beam of light revealed not just one figure, but several more, standing just behind the first. My stomach dropped as I counted them. At least 5 men, all wearing similar masks, each one armed. Some held baseball bats, others gripped crowbars or metal rods, and one even had a shotgun slung over his shoulder. Instinct kicked in. I reached for my gun, pointing it at the group. "Drop your weapons! This is the California Highway Patrol," I shouted, my voice firm but carrying a tremor. The men remained silent, unmoving, their eyes fixed on me through their twisted masks. I took a step back, my gun still trained on them, trying to gauge their next move. They didn't flinch, didn't shift. They just stood there, watching, as though waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine as I became aware of just how isolated I was. The nearest town was miles away, and my backup was probably at least 10 minutes out. My radio crackled as I quickly called for immediate assistance, my voice tight with fear. But before I could finish my call, I heard movement from behind me, the unmistakable sound of leaves crunching and branches snapping. Another figure was approaching from the trees on the other side of the road. Now, surrounded, I felt the sheer weight of my vulnerability. I was alone, miles from any backup, with masked strangers closing in on me. My breath quickened, and I fought to keep my composure. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing my gun at the new arrival. But they didn't heed my warning. Slowly, they began to spread out, moving with an eerie, calm confidence that suggested they'd done this before. Realizing my options were running out, I began inching backward toward my cruiser, my gaze darting between the figures. My heart hammered in my chest, and I knew I had to get out of there. In one swift movement, I spun around, sprinted to my cruiser, and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. As the car roared to life, my headlights illuminated the road ahead, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of masked figures standing at the edge of the road, lining both sides like some twisted, welcoming party. They watched me, motionless, their masked faces blank and expressionless. The sight was like something out of a nightmare, a vision that seemed too surreal to be real. I floored the gas pedal, my car speeding forward, my mind racing. As I sped down the road, I radioed my dispatcher again, this time managing to convey the urgency and fear in my voice. "This is Officer Miller, requesting immediate backup on Route 299, about 10 miles east of Trinity Center. Armed suspects in masks. Please hurry." The dispatcher's voice crackled through, calm but concerned. "Copy that, Officer Miller. Stay safe. Backup is on the way." I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those masked figures following me, but the road behind me remained empty. As I sped away, the adrenaline slowly began to wear off, replaced by a creeping feeling of dread. Who were those people? What were they doing out there, lurking in the middle of the night? When backup finally arrived, we returned to the scene together, but it was as if nothing had happened. The car was gone, leaving no trace behind. No sign of the masked figures, no disturbed branches, no footprints. It was as though they'd vanished into thin air, leaving only the tire marks on the shoulder where the abandoned sedan had been. In the following days, the story spread around the station like wildfire. Officers who'd been in the field for decades shared their own tales of strange encounters on lonely stretches of road, but nothing quite like what I'd described. For the next few weeks, the station assigned extra patrols to that section of Route 299, hoping to catch sight of the masked men or their abandoned car, but they never reappeared. I couldn't shake the experience, though. Every time I was assigned the night shift on that stretch of Route 299, I felt a knot in my stomach. The image of those blank, masked faces burned into my mind. I'd become a cop because I wanted to protect people, but out there in the woods, alone in the dark, I'd felt powerless, exposed, and deeply afraid. I still don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but I can't forget how they looked at me. Like I was just another part of the forest, something to be watched and controlled. It's been months now, and I still drive down Route 299 with a heightened sense of awareness. Sometimes, when I'm alone on the road, I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, and my heart skips a beat. Part of me wonders if it's just my mind playing tricks, haunted by the memory of that night. But another part of me, the part that felt those eyes watching me from behind those masks, knows that they're still out there somewhere, hidden among the trees, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler.